In this volume, I'll be going over generating different kinds of maps through a process commonly referred to as baking. I'll be demonstrating baking using Maya and XNormal, but you can use whichever equivalent software you like because the idea behind baking is pretty universal. This video will focus on baking the kinds of maps that were used on my example model here, Hella, which I consider to be a current generation workflow driven by the use of normal maps. I'm going to try to be as thorough as I can about this topic to address the needs of as many people as I can. The actual texturing process will be discussed in the next volume, but I will be going over the creation of all the different kinds of maps I like to have on hand before texturing. I'll also discuss common baking problems and what you can do to go about fixing them, as well as a few common tips and tricks. There are many different kinds of workflows out there, and what I'm going to discuss here is certainly not the only way to create or work with the baked maps. I'll try to point out common alternatives as I go along and explain why I prefer to do things in certain ways, so that hopefully you can make an informed decision about what will work best for you. The information presented here builds off of what was discussed in the previous volumes in my 3D character art for games tutorial series. The way you build your high and low resolution meshes dramatically affects how your maps will bake, and ultimately the quality of the final product. So I highly recommend getting a firm grasp of that content before continuing here. In the earlier days of game art, all you had to really worry about was a diffuse texture, and maybe a specular map or a bump map if you were lucky. You could paint everything into this map, so you had almost complete control over how it appeared in the game, but the big trade-off was that it worked under relatively static conditions. In this example I have here, this is a piece of fan art I did. It's a World of Warcraft paladin, and it was made using the older technique of relying mostly on the diffuse texture. And actually didn't even make a specular map for this model. Although it looks decent on first inspection, you can see that a lot of the lighting here is actually painted into the texture once you start moving the light around, or the camera. You see that none of these highlights are changing. Now this isn't necessarily a terrible thing. I mean, many games still rely on this kind of thing, but since then, improvements to lighting and rendering technology now require you to think about textures very differently. You can now make your model appear higher resolution and have more interesting visual effects than what was possible in the past. But you also need a lot more information from different kinds of maps in order to make this happen. This data isn't always easy to generate by hand, which is where baking comes into play. So what is baking and why do we need to do it? Well, the basic idea behind baking is to sample the surface information of one model to create a map that another model can use to convey a similar effect. The most obvious example of this is a normal map, where you can make your low polygon model look like your high resolution model. The baking process helps ensure that the details from all of these different maps line up together. Before we get started on baking, there are a few things we should do to prepare ourselves. To start with, you'll need two models. Typically, this is a high resolution model and a low polygon model. Your high resolution model can be created in any way you like, really. It can be sculpted in a program like ZBrush, like I have here, or you could have hard surface modeled it traditionally in something like Maya or Max, or whatever works best for you. Your high resolution model can also consist of multiple meshes, so don't think that you have to get your bakes done in a single pass. In fact, it's almost inevitable that you have to break things up a little bit for easier baking, unless your model is really simple, like it's just a nude body, then maybe you could get away with just having one mesh for the high res and a single one for the low res. But we'll go over tackling complex bake situations a little bit later. On the model here, you can see that I actually have quite a few different subtools here, and in a lot of cases I keep it like this, so that I'll build depending on how you built your low polygon model, sometimes it's easier to keep it separate and bake these components separately and then combine it together later. It just really depends, and that kind of thing. Once you have more experience, you can kind of predict how things will bake, and you'll be able to make better decisions about what to keep together and what to separate. In this case, a lot of these pieces are separate because I actually had a lot of polygons to work with. But if your polygon limit was a lot more modest, then you might have to consolidate a lot of these things. For the low polygon model, the main requirement is that it needs to match the shapes of the high resolution model in order to avoid baking problems. There are a few situations where generalizing the shape of the low polygon model can actually yield better results in the bake, but generally speaking, having more polygons that conform closely to the high resolution model will make things easier for you. Every polygon face on your low polygon model also needs to have some sort of UV coordinate info. If you don't, then you'll probably get an error when baking. After all, the program needs to know what to do with the surfaces that it samples. However, one thing I want to clear up right away is that you only really need UV information on the low polygon model and not on the high polygon model. That's not to say that there aren't uses for having UVs on the high-res model, but they don't really come into play during the actual baking process. And I personally almost never bothered creating UVs for the high-res model because it just isn't necessary in most cases, unless you're using it as a way to help you do something specific, like getting more detail on your sculpt somehow. But for baking, it's just something that you don't have to worry about. Both the high and low res models should consist of polygons with 3 or 4 sides. So triangles, quads, but no n-gons, which is faces with more than 4 sides. Usually if you have that, it's prone to have baking errors, or you just get an error outright and it won't bake at all. And n-gons, honestly, they're kind of bad practice for game art anyway. Normally, when I go to bake, I will triangulate my model, or triangulate and then export it and use that for baking. And that's mostly just because I want the triangulation to stay consistent throughout the process, so that whatever the triangulation Maya uses, I'm sure that it's used in whatever program I'm using to bake. And I went over that in one of the previous videos. Something I should have mentioned back at the modeling stages is that ideally your meshes should be at the proper scale and orientation before it goes to baking. It's easy to forget about scale and orientation and then have it become a source of stress later on, so make sure to do your homework. Talk to your client or boss and try to get these things sorted out as soon as possible, because really nothing will make you feel more stupid than struggling with a bake only to find that the reason why it's not working is because your meshes aren't even in the same place, or something like that. I remember there was a time when we were having problems with ZBrush exporting at a different scale than what we'd bring the base meshes in, so that if we tried to bake at that point, then the high and low res wouldn't match, and then especially if you're making an X normal where you can't, where you don't really see what's happening, it can just cause a lot of frustration. And I've had to deal with models from other artists that were made, entirely upside down and backwards because they were using a different coordinate system, and at completely different scales. And believe me, that's not fun. It's true that you could just rotate and rescale the final low polygon model, but the problem is that if you ever need to go back and make an edit, then it can be very difficult and unintuitive to deal with. Keeping all of your meshes at the proper scale will just make everyone's life easier, including your own. If you're working on a project where the characters are made to scale to each other, then you can also be more confident that the settings you use when baking for one character can be reasonably close for use on another character, at least as a starting point. And even if I'm just making person art, I try to use some kind of real-world scale, such as centimeters, and that's what I have on this model here. You can see that my Hela character is 178 centimeters tall, or about 5'10", something like that. Using real-world scale makes it relatively easy to convert to other measurements if that becomes necessary, and this also helps the model work more predictably when moving between different programs. For example, some lighting and rendering calculations are based off of real-world measurements, so having a model that is too large or too small can really complicate things, such as lighting and shadowing calculations. It can also cause some problems with, camera clipping planes, Z-fighting, all sorts of things like that. So it's best to get everyone on the same page and work from there. I know a lot of that sounds like common sense, but I come across all these problems quite often, and they can really be a pain to work around. A common question that gets asked is, what texture size should I use for my character model? Well, texture size really depends on the kind of game it is and how the character will be viewed. Ideally, this is something you should be thinking about even before you start modeling, but if you haven't made a character before and you're not sure what size to use, then I recommend doing some research on games that are similar to what you want to make and try to match their specifications. Especially if you're a student, I recommend sticking to modest texture sizes. For real-time game models, you should really be able to demonstrate that you understand how to create an optimized model that still looks great. And using 2K maps all the time is not really a challenge for that. There are still a lot of games today that have really great looking models that use just a fraction of, like a 2K map. So, having a larger texture is not going to magically make your texture better. So learn to work with the limitations and keep the big picture in mind when evaluating your model's textures. Look at the model from a game viewing distance and not zoomed in all the way on all the details. This can also help you improve your speed by letting you avoid doing work that players are unlikely to notice, because high resolution textures seriously take a lot longer than a low resolution model, because you have to spend a lot more time trying to get the most out of them so that it stands up to close scrutiny. Normally, you want to stick to texture sizes that are power of 2. Powers of 2 are common computer use because a lot of the science behind it is based off of binary systems. Basically, this means that your textures will tend to be sized in these increments. Usually texture sizes will be square, but you will occasionally come across textures that are an additional power of 2 in one direction, such as having a 512 by 1024 texture. It's technically possible to have other sizes, but You should stick with powers of 2 because if you make your texture even a little bit larger, then the texture won't fit as well into memory, and you end up wasting space that other textures could have used. Unless required otherwise, I like to do the following for texture sizes. And this is not a hard and fast rule by any means. It's just what I like to do. If given the decision to make, this is what I would decide, and that is if the texture is around 256 or below, then I would work at resolution. In other words, my source file would also be 256. And that's mostly because this is easier to keep things looking sharp and clear with a limited number of pixels. If you work higher than that and you downsize, you run the risk of things kind of getting a little bit blurry. Even if you sharpen it, things will always be better if you place the pixels deliberately at this kind of resolution. At texture resolutions from 512 to 1K, I like to work at 2 times that resolution. It's usually safe to resize and sharpen the texture, and after you're done with it, and that produces a good enough result for me. So once you start getting into textures that are 2K or larger, then I start to work at that resolution again, and that's because the files just become really unwieldy. Unless you have a very powerful machine with tons of RAM, working with 4K texture maps, with tons of layers and stuff, that can really kill your machine, and everything will slow down. So again, these are just guidelines that I like to use for myself. Obviously, whatever, depending on whatever project you have, they may have different requirements. But aside from that, before you commit to fully texturing, it's a good idea to try some test bakes to make sure that the decisions you made when you're laying out your UVs were actually the right ones. If things aren't looking good, then you might have to re-examine your UV layout and even how you may have modeled some things before resorting to something like increasing the texture size, because in most cases, that texture size limitation is not something that can budge. In a game production, it's a lot easier to go down than to go up on texture sizes, because that's one of those things where it's a big hit on performance. So instead of asking your boss for more texture space, what you really probably should be doing is finding ways to reallocate your UVs, or to simplify your modeling for a better result in game. Sometimes this means sacrificing details, but keep the big picture in mind about whether or not those details are really crucial. Because sometimes what's important to you as an artist and what is important to the game and the gameplay can be very different things. So I'm not saying that you can't ever push for higher resolutions, because obviously sometimes it becomes a necessity, but it's usually one of those last resort things. Unless you plan on creating your meshes and baking textures all within the same program, it's very likely that you're going to have to, at some point, export your high and low res meshes to a file format that can be used by other programs. This is a good way to make sure that all of these programs are referencing the same mesh for bake results that are consistent. .obj files are just about as close as you can get to a universal file format for mesh data. It contains all of the data that we need for baking, including an index of the vertices, normal information, UV information in vertex color. OBJ files can also be saved with .mtl files, material files, but that's not something I ever make use of in my own work, and usually I'll either delete them or I'll change the export options so that they aren't even created. OBJ files are what we'll be using when moving models between programs, but it's not the final format that you would ever submit to a game. A lot of times you would be better off with something like FBX or another kind of proprietary file format, but since we're just making a game model for a portfolio piece, we won't worry about that. For textures, we'll be using Targa files or .tga files. I'll be using 32-bit uncompressed Targa files because it's lossless and it includes alpha channel data. Uncompressed files, although they do occupy more disk space, they're faster to work with because they're not compressed. The file size of the texture is not really something we need to concern ourselves with at this point. So don't think that you're making better game art or more optimized game art because you're using a JPEG file or something like that. You should never be using JPEG files because it's really lossy and it has no alpha channel. And picking a file format that has an alpha channel is really important because a lot of modern shaders make use of it in some way or another. Ideally, you want to be able to create the look you want with as few files as possible, and the alpha channel is a very convenient location to store more data that an advanced shader can use. There are other file formats, of course, that have alpha channels like TIFF, PNG, BMP, but we'll be using Targa here. I think it's more common in the game industry to use Targa. And also the nice thing about a Targa file is that because it is lossless, it means that if you save it out and you're using it to preview your model and somehow you lose your source file, your PSD file, then at least you have a file that you can fall back on. I mean, you won't have your layers or whatever, but at least it's a nice quality file to work with again. When it comes to the final export of textures, the most common file format is probably DDS because it has a lot of real-time game art functionality built in, such as bitmaps and optimized compression. But we won't be using it here because that's kind of like the final step before you submit your model to the game. And also DDS compression is pretty slow and makes it kind of laborious to iterate with. So we'll just stick with Targa files for now. This is a good time to talk about organizing files. I admit that I often procrastinate about organizing my files as well, but it'll save you a lot of time and effort the earlier you do it. And of course, it helps other artists in the production figure out what you're doing as well. I know this is really boring stuff, so I won't talk about it for too long, but it's pretty frustrating when you have to go and help someone. You sit down at the computer and you find out that all of their files are on their desktop, of all places, and their files are all mixed in with all sorts of other unrelated files, and all the files are named ASDF or 12345, or they're appended with new 1, new 2, new 3. So do yourself a favor, create a dedicated directory for each project and try to keep your working files separate from your final files to avoid clutter. Come up with a logical naming convention for your files and try to organize things so you don't have to jump in and out of different directories all of the time. Naming conventions aren't that big of a deal when you're working by yourself, but if you're working with others, then you're going to want to be more organized than that, especially if you're producing a large number of assets. A rule of thumb used in a lot of projects is to be descriptive with your file names, but terse. So, also trying to keep things as short as possible. And organize it from broader to finer. For example, if you're setting up a big project, you could start with something like this, where you have the name of the project and then an art folder, assuming you have other kinds of files in this project, like programming or sound or whatever. And in art, in our case, it would be characters to separate from environment art or effects or animations. And then within that, you'd have, I don't know, maybe the race or the gender, and then drilling down to more descriptive terms, such as the name of the character. And then within that, you could have your textures or source files or whatever. I recommend using some kind of folder bookmarking program. I have, for my own work, I like to use Direct Folders. It's a free program where you can, that works within Windows Explorer, that can help you jump to different places really quickly and easily. And there are a ton of these kinds of programs out there, and a lot of them are free. So I definitely recommend taking some time and looking through some. The baking stage is really the best time to get your act together and make sure all of your files are going to work together nicely. There's a lot that can go wrong when you're baking maps, and there are a lot of files to deal with, so the last thing you want is to have any complications come about because of files that are misnamed or misplaced. Here are the different kind of maps that we discussed in this volume. Some maps can be used pretty much directly as rendered, such as the normal map. But other maps are going to be used in conjunction with other maps to create certain effects. I'm able to derive most of what I need for texturing from these few maps. Depending on what kind of shaders you have access to and the target art direction, you may not need all of these maps, or you may need some more. However, these are probably the most common ones, and once you become familiar with these, then it should be pretty easy for you to pick up other kinds of maps. You should get into the habit of thinking of your maps as resources to help you create the effects that you need. It's always safer to derive critical details from accurate sources, such as a baked map, so that you're guaranteed that everything will line up. Later on in the texturing stages, I can paint the diffuse texture more freely because I'm confident that the foundation that the ambient occlusion and cavity maps provide is in sync with the normal map, and this is a critical part of getting clean results. Once you develop a process that you like, it's easy to replicate your results onto other textures. This will help you produce additional models that look consistent and in an efficient manner. There are a few other maps that we will generate ourselves during the texturing stage. Things like specular, gloss, and emissive, but that will be covered in the next volume. For now, let's take a closer look at these maps, why we need them, and how to make them. I like to render normal maps first because it gives me a good idea of how successful I'll be when rendering the other maps. If I'm not able to get a good normal map yet, then going through with the other maps is almost pointless. Remember that your goal when baking normal maps is to try and reproduce the look of the high poly model as closely as you can. At game viewing distance, your normal map model should be virtually indistinguishable from the high resolution model. I feel like I need to say this because I often see beginners settle for normal maps that are plagued with errors, but they just accept the result because it looks bumpy and detailed. Most people think of normal maps only as a way to create more detail, but just as important is its ability to smooth out and create clean shapes that would be impossible with the crude normals of a low polygon model alone. In this example here, I have a high polygon model and low polygon model, and you can see that the shading on the low polygon model on this curved surface, you can see how the light is showing up stronger on the edges, the polygonal edges. So it creates a sort of faceted and soft look that isn't as smooth as this one, the high polygon model. If I turn on the norm map, then you can see that a lot of those problems goes away. I mean, obviously the norm map here is creating the beveled edge as well. You know, that's what I consider to be more of the detail part of it, and then it's smoothing out these shapes in here. The normal map is one of the most crucial maps to get right because it's responsible for providing most of the visual contrast on the model under normal lighting conditions. Even here where there isn't really light, you can see that a lot of the lightest and darkest values on this model are being provided through the normal map. If I turn off the normal map, you can see that there's nothing there. There's no great value difference, which is what the human eye needs in order to differentiate shapes like that. In most current generation of games, I'd say that the normal map is just as important, if not more so, than the diffuse texture, which is what a lot of people typically think of when referring to a game model's texture. I say this because if you have a good normal map, and a good lighting and rendering engine, the diffuse texture can be almost anything without it breaking the illusion of the shapes. The strong values here created by the lit and shadow surfaces will still be accurate even if you screw up on your textures. However, if you had the opposite situation where the normal map had a lot of problems in it, then there's only so much you can do with the diffuse texture to try to fix those